It's Friday, May 1st. I'm Brian Walsh, and welcome to This Week in Impact, where I talk with ImpactAlpha journalists and editors about some of the most interesting impact investing stories we've been covering. This week, I'm joined by editor Jessica Pothering. We'll discuss the latest in Africa's carbon markets, from nature-based solutions to clean cooking. Plus, wealthy athletes are getting into the impact investing game. And later, editor David Bank will join me to debrief his impressions from this week's Mission Investors Exchange, a gathering of foundation leaders. That's all coming up on This Week in Impact. Hi, Jessica. Welcome back to the podcast. It's been a minute.
Hi, Brian. Thanks. It's great to be back.
All right, first up, you're the editor for all things emerging markets for ImpactAlpha. Lately, you've written some stories about developments in the carbon markets, especially in Africa, with some promising developments on nature-based solutions and some challenges and a mixed bag in the clean cooking sector. So let's start with nature-based solutions. You covered a deal this week out of South Africa that's based on a native desert plant called Spec Boom. Tell us about this deal and why it got your attention.
Well, actually, the reason this deal caught my attention is because I first learned about this plant called Spec Boom when I was living in Cape Town about a decade ago. Just a word on Spec Boom, it's this little succulent plant that is native to the western region of South Africa. And what's cool about it is that, one, it's just very robust, but then it has the benefit of being able to help restore the health of degraded soil, and eventually to, creating a nurturing environment that can bring back native plant species. And this particular deal is a major land restoration project that's being led by this company out of Singapore called Imperative. They're looking to restore some 250,000 acres of degraded land in South Africa's Eastern Cape. And what's significant about this specific plot of land is it's this area called the Albany Thicket, and it's home to some 1,500 native plant species, about 20% of which can only be found there on Earth. And so it's been degraded over time, largely by livestock grazing. And this whole replanting effort using this plant called Spec Boom promises to not only restore the soils and bring back some of the region's biodiversity, but also to trap and sequester carbon at the same time.
So it's a reforestation project, but it's also a carbon market project. So how does this play out as a carbon market?
Yeah, so Imperative basically is, expecting that it can calculate a certain amount of carbon that can be trapped into the soil through this replanting effort. And it has already signed on to a pretty significant offtake agreement with Amazon to buy those credits starting, I believe they will be generated starting in 2031. So Amazon's come on as a secure offtake buyer for the credits that the project generates.
All right, so super interesting. So let's talk deal terms. How much money are we talking about for this project?
Yeah, so Imperative's been underway on this already for about 2 years. This is a multi-phase project, so they've completed phase one of the project, which covered about 25,000 acres of the thicket. And now they're going into phase two, which is going to be much bigger, 125,000 acres. And that'll obviously cost a lot more money. So what they've done, they've gone out, they've raised 91 million for phase two of the project. 25 million of that is coming from a bond that the World Bank listed, and the remainder is coming from a consortium of private investors. But what's cool is, so the World Bank, they issued this much bigger bond. It was $120 million to finance nature restoration projects worldwide, and 25 million of that will go specifically to the Spec Boom project. And the way it's structured is, so investors signed on for, just a modest 2.4% fixed rate coupon between now and when the bond matures in 2040. But as those credits are released starting in 2031 to Amazon, they'll also get an additional payment that sort of boosts their returns. So that offtake agreement with Amazon has been really crucial to getting private investors to participate in this deal.
All right, so Imperative and their Spec Boom project is an example of a nature-based solution that does carbon removal, removing carbon from the atmosphere. Let's transition to the other type of carbon credit, that's carbon avoidance. And you wrote about the clean cooking space. Now, for those who have been following international development for some time, know that this has been a long hoped-for solution. I actually remember Hillary Clinton promoting them when she was Secretary of State in the first Obama administration. So before we get into how clean cooking solution works in the carbon markets, tell us about clean cooking as a sector in general.
Clean cooking, I mean, as you mentioned, has been a topic in the international development space for a long time. Most of the companies that I know in the clean cooking space sort of emerged around the same time that off-grid solar emerged. I feel like these two sectors kind of went together. They were often targeting the same types of customers, and had many of the same kinds of challenges with high-priced, fairly unproven products that they had to build a base for, effectively build a market from scratch. And what the clean cooking companies were trying to do is get households in emerging markets, primarily in Africa, to stop using open fires and other kind of crude cooking mechanisms and switch to products that were more efficient. You know, they didn't emit as much indoor smoke and had a better impact on health, and also didn't emit as much smoke into the atmosphere and have a negative impact on the environment. So it's important because when you have hundreds of millions of households whose primary way of cooking for their families is over an open fire, that can have a really negative health impact on a large swath of the population, and also a really negative impact on deforestation and just climate in general.
Yeah, so clean cooking is one of those ideals that in one of these objectives that people are trying to get to, but the math doesn't always work out.
So then enter the carbon markets. A few years ago, folks in the clean cooking space realized that there were ways to estimate how much carbon dioxide was not being emitted into the atmosphere through the use of their technologies, right? So people weren't burning charcoal anymore, or they were burning charcoal better. They weren't burning firewood anymore. They were, using actually natural gas instead, which is cleaner. And by making a calculation over how much carbon was not being emitted into the atmosphere, they could tap into a specific type of carbon markets, the avoidance markets, and sell those credits largely on the voluntary market. But there's also another option, which is the focus of my story, called the compliance markets, which are these much more rigorous bilateral markets that were established on the Paris Climate Agreement.
So, Jessica, in your piece, you wrote about two companies in two countries with two different carbon deals that had two very different outcomes in trying to access the compliance carbon markets. So, tell us about each of those two deals.
The first is a company called Burn Manufacturing. They're actually based in Kenya, and the deal at hand involves their work in Nigeria. And they secured an agreement with the Nigerian government to be able to trade credits from their cooking operations in Nigeria to foreign buyers. The second company is one called Cocoa Networks. They're also based in Kenya. And they had been negotiating for a long time with the Kenyan government to be able to secure a similar type of authorization to sell their clean cooking credits to foreign buyers. But that agreement never came through. And long story short, Cocoa was forced to close down in February. And so it's kind of a tale of two companies, and it highlights the risks that are still inherent in, depending on carbon markets for financing of clean cooking solutions.
So it sounds like the issue here is the unit economics of clean cooking sector requires these kind of carbon credits to help finance and make the math work out. And when those carbon credits don't come through, that's a real risk for the sustainability of the model.
That's right. The woman I spoke to at Burn, who heads their carbon solutions work, Molly Brown, was talking about, there's Burn Manufacturing has come up with multiple different ways to ensure that their business model can be sustained even if a carbon market's disappeared, right? But that the compliance markets, which fetch higher prices than the voluntary markets, are, the sort of top priority. And then they also have channels into the voluntary markets in case that doesn't come through. So they've really done a lot of thinking around their exposure and risks in the carbon markets and ensuring that their business isn't fully dependent on that. Whereas cocoa, from what it sounds like, there was just so much focus on this authorization with the Kenyan government that there wasn't much of a backup plan at hand. And then when that didn't come through, the business was just too vulnerable to stay open.
All right. Well, you can Jessica's recent coverage on the African carbon markets on impactalpha.com. There's also a link in our show notes. Later in the show, David Bank will join to discuss this week's Mission Investors Exchange conference. But for now, we'll take a quick break. When we come back, Jessica and I will discuss the growing roster of professional athletes getting involved in impact investing.
Hi there, Agent of Impact. This is Dennis Price, CEO of ImpactAlpha. For more than a decade, ImpactAlpha has been helping you find the alpha in impact. We've now built ImpactAlpha Edge to bring you structured data and market intelligence to help you move faster, invest smarter, and multiply your impact. ImpactAlpha Edge is designed to help GPs and fund managers raise capital more effectively, LPs and allocators find each other, and discover overlooked opportunities. Think of it as a purpose-built pitch book for impact, with the editorial judgment and network trust that no algorithm can replicate. Come check it out. Book a demo today. Learn more about ImpactAlpha Edge in our show notes.
Next up, athletes have long been told to stick to sports. The conservative pundit Laura Ingraham famously told NBA star LeBron James to, quote, shut up and dribble. Yet a new generation of professional athletes is getting into the impact investing game. Our Rudy Sonatas wrote about this trend for us this week. Now, Jessica, athletes investing their capital for social impact isn't new. I mean, after all, Magic Johnson has been doing it for decades. But something seems to be shifting. This new generation isn't just writing checks to charities. They're anchoring funds, acting as general partners, and targeting specific market failures in the communities they come from. So, Jessica, let's start with Tobias Harris of the Detroit Pistons. He created a fund to help first-time homebuyers in Detroit. Tell us about that.
That's right. The Piston Star has a program called the Tobias Harris Homeownership Initiative, which is focusing on helping first-time home buyers with down payment assistance in the Detroit area. So he's trying to help bring this high impact initiative back to the market where he is playing and where most of his fans are based, and which is also, a market that is historically underserved and underinvested and has historically had a number of property challenges. And so he's one of a growing number, actually, of NBA players who are rolling out impact investing initiatives like this.
Yeah, I know Rudy was excited to talk to Tobias Harris for this story because he is not only a huge NBA fan, but he's also been covering the home ownership beat for us here at Impact Alpha.
Yes, I chatted with Rudy about that actually, and I think that was something that he was really excited about, was seeing his love for basketball converge with his love for all things ownership economy. He said that, he just really loved connecting with Tobias Harris and learning about his own backstory and his impact beyond the basketball court. But another fun detail that he shared with me was actually when Rudy first started reporting for his college newspaper, he started as a sports reporter. So I think he really enjoyed working on this story because those two worlds, impact and sports, collided in that way too.
It's a good story for us and a good story for Rudy. But this Tobias Harris wasn't the only story. What are some other examples of athletes who are getting involved in the impact investing game?
Right. So Rudy and some of our colleagues on the Impact Alpha Edge data team did some digging to see how many athletes do have impact investing initiatives like these. And I think we turned up, over a dozen of them. One of the most well-known ones, of course, is Serena Williams. She's been investing personally, but also through her own venture capital fund, Serena Ventures. And then also he found quite a number of just NBA players who are doing this. One is, Boston Celtics guard Jaylen Brown, who started an accelerator and incubator program in the Boston area called Exchange for Creative and Social Entrepreneurs. Another one we actually wrote about a number of years ago is Chris Paul. He's also an NBA star. He was working with Turner Impact Capital on a multifamily impact fund. You mentioned Magic Johnson, of course, already. And, LeBron James himself also has been doing his own impact work with his company, Spring Hill Company, which produces content that's focused on social justice and also empowering athletes.
So talk about a net impact.
Okay, Brian. Well, puns aside, the one last thing I did want to highlight about this story is, as I mentioned, we started compiling this database of athlete impact investors, and I expect that list will grow over time. But for those who are interested in the crossover between the sports world and the impact world, you can check out the database that we've been compiling, and feel free to feedback too if you know of others that we don't have included yet.
And you can read Rudy's story on wealthy athletes getting into the impact investing game on ImpactAlpha.com. There's also a link in our show notes. But speaking of Serena Williams, she was a featured speaker at this week's Mission Investors Exchange, which I will debrief with David Bank after the break. But for now, I just want to say thank you, Jessica, for joining us.
Thanks a lot, Brian.
Finally, this week, I'm joined by editor David Bank, who's just back from the Mission Investors Exchange Conference in Atlanta, Georgia. David, to start us off, for those who don't know, what is MIE, or the Mission Investors Exchange?
Mission Investors Exchange is actually, they were celebrating their 20th birthday or their 20th anniversary, and it grew out of the program-related investments that some foundations had been making, and they wanted a kind of, community of practice of folks who were making those kind of investments. But now, of course, folks are also investing from their endowment side, the foundations are, and that's what's called mission-related investments. Those are the kind of two categories of foundation investments, and those camps or those managers of those kinds of funds have come together under Mission Investors Exchange. So it's essentially the impact investing arms of many of the, or if not all of the major foundations now. And then the folks who are interested in being part of that ecosystem.
Some of these foundations have set aside up to $1 billion or more from their endowments to be motivated towards mission. And so they need fund managers and others to kind of put that money to work for them.
Yeah, that's right. There's actually two, within this, there's yet another set of camps, and there's the 100%ers who are moving all of their assets on the endowment side to at least be quote aligned with their mission, sometimes very specifically with their mission. With Next 50 is a foundation out in Denver that is all about valuing aging and sort of healthy aging, and they're moving their $265 million endowment specifically into aging friendly or value investments that value aging. Some just say, oh, it should all be, sort of screened at the minimum for screen out sort of the bad things, and then also allocated to across impact categories, if not specifically on their issues. So there's the 100%ers, and then there's the folks that have carve-outs of parts of their endowment, like the Ford Foundation has this $1 billion carve-out for mission investing, and they've been investing that in affordable housing and a lot of emerging markets, and a number of other priorities that they have. So all those different kind of strategies all come together at MIE.
So what were some of the key takeaways from this year's conference?
Well, it was interesting. I went there to sort of take the temperature of the leaders of these foundations and their impact investing arms on sort of the current moment, or as people say, sometimes the current environment is the euphemism. And we're in, sort of a volatile moment for philanthropy, but, society more broadly, or the world more broadly. And so the question was, how is philanthropy and how are our impact investors, agents of impact, stepping up? Tonya Allen of the McKnight Foundation in Minneapolis has emerged as kind of the bold voice in the room. And you can imagine when all of that went down in Minneapolis this winter, McKnight was very much involved in that response. And so there's a little bit of street cred from that experience. But it's happened in many cities and across many issue areas. So there was a kind of a rallying around a kind of call for boldness, and the theme of the conference overall was leading in the moment.
And this moment involves a lot of themes that we've been covering here at Impact Alpha, including the ethical AI stack. So, what were the conversations around AI?
Yeah, Impact Alpha moderated two of the main breakout panels on ethical AI and also on the ownership economy. And on the AI front, I think that was very much front and center for folks. I mean, it's disrupting almost every process in finance, of course, but organizations more broadly. And the call went out by Mike Kubzanski. He's just leaving the Omidyar network to form an investment effort called Andaris.ai that is going to be investing up and down the stack of AI, and that's not just AI for good at the top level, and there are plenty of applications for it, that can be very helpful for lots of kinds of projects, but really in the AI infrastructure itself, and of course that people think a lot about data centers and the environmental and other impacts of that, but also just in how the LLMs and the algorithms themselves operate. Of course, there's concerns about bias. And it's not just racial bias or gender bias. I think it could also be like bias towards shareholder supremacy or profit maximization. And you can imagine that in an impact crowd, there might be other ways to optimize the technology for sort of more broad-based, social and environmental benefit.
Now, David, you reported there was about 800 people at this conference. Do you have a sense about whether the pie is growing in the foundations that are committed to mission investing? Or are we saying that kind of the same usual suspects that show up year after year, or are we seeing some new foundations or old foundations new to this space?
Actually, I think there is a influx, and it's not so much the big foundations which have kind of made their peace with it, whether it's a carve out or a program related investment program or whatnot. But there's lots of newcomers, and these are both smaller foundations that are coming up, and also family offices now, which are a little bit of a different flavor. But if you have a family that wants to put its assets to work, they actually have quite a lot of flexibility. They might have a kind of quasi nonprofit arm, whether that's a DAF or a foundation, but they also have a kind of LLC in some cases that's essentially a company, and that company can make investments with a social lens on it. And so they have lots of tools at their disposal, and they also have the living donor or the living investor, as the case may be, and that can often speed decision making. And so there's a lot of attention on family offices. And then there's another category that we're seeing show up a lot, which are social enterprises that actually have a going business but are nonprofits but generate revenues and cash from their businesses, and now have quite sizable endowments. So there's a whole set of foundations that grew out of the student loan processing business, and when that started getting wound down, a lot of those organizations became essentially foundations. We worked a lot and talked a lot with WES, the World Education Services, that also has a going business but has a balance sheet, and they're trying to align that 100% with positive impact.
So earlier in the show, when I talked to Jessica about athletes getting involved in impact investing, we teased that Serena Williams was at MIE. What did she have to say?
Yeah, she caught quite a buzz when she came in, and she's both there's a number of athletes that are LPs that have some wealth from their careers. She's the rare one who's also a GP, and Serena Ventures had raised $111 million in its first run, and probably trying to raise at least double that in its second fund that they're raising now. And she's actively looking for tech-enabled ventures and for underrepresented founders, and she's an impact investor. An impact GP as well as an LP. And then the closeout of the whole conference was Brian Stevenson, and folks might know it from the movie and the book Just Mercy and the Equal Justice Initiative down in Montgomery, Alabama. And he was just stunningly eloquent in closing out the conference and essentially said two things. One, now's not the time to turn back on the progress that's been made, and another that I think really resonated with folks, which is get close or proximate, as he said, to the communities and the people that these programs and investments and grants and whatnot are intended to serve, and sort of get out of the office and into the field and close to the folks and the communities. And I think people took that to heart, and it kind of reminded them why they're all in this work.
All right. Well, you can read the write-up that David, you, and Dennis Price wrote on the MIE conference on ImpactAlpha.com. There's also a link in our show notes. But that's going to do it for this episode of This Week in Impact. Thank you, David.
Thank you, Brian, and thank you, Jessica.
And thank you all for listening. This Week in Impact is a production of Impact Alpha and part of the Impact Alpha podcast network. Smart conversations by and for impact investing professionals. For exclusive stories and insights about the world of impact investing and sustainable finance, join thousands of other agents of impact by subscribing. Just go to impactalpha.com/subscribe for full access. Thanks, as always, to our producer extraordinaire, Isaac Silk. For Jessica Pothering and David Bank, I'm Brian Walsh, Managing Director of the impact advisory firm Human Nature. We'll see you next week for more Impact.